Hello and welcome to this very, very long overdue third episode of the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. I'm your host, Dan Nash, PhD researcher in exercise physiology and 2:15 marathon runner. Firstly, yes, let me apologise for the very long delay since that second episode. I really did intend to make it a more regular thing and keep the episodes coming, and I kept having the intention of doing it and producing another episode, and I had tons of ideas. But I'm sure you all know life gets busy and it just didn't happen for one reason or the other. But we are now back and I'm excited to share some more physiology content with all of you. I also really appreciated all the messages that were requesting the third episode. It was really nice to hear that everyone was enjoying the content I was producing. And yeah, apologies, it has taken me so long to produce another episode. But yeah, as I said, we're back and I'm excited to share with you some more content. So what are we going to talk about today? So what I want to talk about today are the physiological determinants of endurance running performance. And I think people are very aware of what these are. People here know what I've heard, the term VO2 max, thresholds, running economy, etc. But what I want to do today is pull it all together into the established model or physiological model of endurance running performance. And I think that's what people don't seem to have an appreciation of, or at least that's my understanding, is that people in isolation understand VO2 max and other physiological parameters, but actually how do they tie together? And I think that becomes quite important for actually how do we prescribe training to improve these parameters, what are the parameters we need to work on depending upon the event that they're training for and their personal characteristics. And how do we use this model to interpret results that you get from a physiological test or a battery of tests? So that's basically what I want to go through today. So actually, what is the physiological model of endurance performance, which basically encompasses VO2 max, metabolic thresholds, and running economy. So how does that model work? How do all those parameters fit together? Some sub-determinants of physiological performance. So actually, in addition to those key attributes, what other things are important when we're talking about more the middle distance events or the longer events, so marathon, ultra running events, etc. What are the slight differences in the model that we see in those two extremes? I'm going to also break down actually those key components of a model. So actually VO2 max, what contributes to VO2 max, what contributes to our thresholds, what contributes to our economy, and what are the training interventions that might help target these different components. And then lastly, sort of talking about more the event-specific demands. So actually, what are the physiological parameters that are probably more important to optimize in the middle distances versus actually maybe the 10K plus or ultra events, etc. And also a bit of pulling it all together. So actually, we talk about the events, but actually, what absolute values are good and what are less good, and how do those values sit in relation to each other, which might not make sense when I'm talking about it now, but hopefully when we get to that section, it will make more sense. And then, just applying all of this, the conversation that we've talked about today to training, and actually how can it inform training, how can it inform our event choices, how can it inform our tactics or pacing strategies, depending upon our own physiological parameters. So I hope that sounds interesting. If not, you can turn off now. Wait for episode 4, which I promise won't take another 6 months to come out. So with that bit of an intro done, let's jump straight in. So the physiological model of endurance running performance It's probably classically ascribed to Michael Joyner in the late 90s, and he basically came up with this idea that there are three main determinants of aerobic events. So firstly, we've got our VO2 max, which sets the ceiling for aerobic capacity. We've then got our metabolic thresholds, which determine what percentage of our VO2 max that we can sustain. And then we've got our running economy, which is which basically determines how good are we at turning this energy into forward propulsion, forward locomotion, like running velocity effectively. And together that's going to determine the speed that we can sustain for a given event. Now, let's go into those into a bit more detail. So VO2 max, I think most people have got some idea of what VO2 max is, but let's get everyone on the same page. So VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen that we can breathe in through our lungs, get absorbed into the blood, transported around the blood via our hemoglobin, and then importantly taken up and used by the working muscles. So actually, when we are measuring this in the lab, what we are doing, or what we're using machines or devices to do, is measure the difference between the amount of oxygen that we're breathing in and the amount of oxygen that we're breathing out. So actually, it's that difference that we're looking at, the amount of oxygen that is being consumed by the body, which is used to generate energy from a breakdown of carbohydrates and fat stores. So that's primarily what VO2 max is. And we can either talk about it in liters per minute. So how many liters per minute can we breathe in and use through the muscles, or we talk about a scaled VO2 max. So actually, the amount of oxygen we use per kilogram of body weight. So instead of talking about liters per minute, we typically talk about milliliters per kilogram of body weight per minute. And that's the classic, 50 to 80 number that you might have heard. It might be lower than that, it might be higher than that. But if people quote their VO2 max to you, they're normally giving you the scaled VO2 max number. And that's because certainly in running events where we've got to carry our body weight, it makes sense to scale it to our mass, because actually a good 60-70 kilo runner might have a VO2 max of 3.5 to 4 liters, whereas actually a rower, because they're so much bigger, they've got more muscle mass, they can use a lot more oxygen, so they can be 5+ liters per minute. But actually, that's not in rowing, because you don't need to support your own body weight, so weight is much less of an issue. So when we're talking about, that's why it's important to scale it when we're talking about runners. And that's why people typically talk about their VO2 max in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. So the exercise intensity at which VO2 max occurs is not very sustainable. So we typically think about race paces or race durations of about 5 to 8 minutes is typically what we think about when we're talking about speed at VO2 max or VO2 max, velocity at VO2 max. Now, obviously, this isn't very sustainable. And that's because in addition to our aerobic metabolism that's going on, we are going to have a lot of glycolysis, so anaerobic energy metabolism happening. That's going to be heavily upregulated, which means that we're going to see the breakdown of our phosphocreatine stores, the production of phosphate ions, the production of hydrogen ions, and the acidification that comes with that. And ultimately, this is going to lead to fatigue and the inability of our muscles to contract. It's going to shut down these products of metabolism are going to shut down the contractile machinery that are going to be that anyone who's raced the 1500 meters, 800 meters are going to be familiar with these sensations where you're trying as hard as you can to contract your muscles to run fast down the track in that last home straight, but you just can't. You can't up that speed anymore. And so actually, VO2 max is obviously very important because that sets the ceiling of your aerobic metabolism. Okay, that's the maximum rate on which you can turn over energy through aerobic processes. But the fraction of that VO2 max that you can sustain is probably more important, especially in the longer events. So if we're talking about the 5K, 10K, half marathon, that's where it becomes much more important in terms of what fraction of a VO2 max you can sustain. And what this comes down to is what I referred to in our introduction as our metabolic thresholds. And now, to get a really deep dive on this, I'd go back to the second episode, which was recorded probably like 10 months ago now, 8 months ago, I can't even remember, which talks about critical speed. But effectively, the primary determinant of the fraction of VO2 max that we can sustain is what's commonly referred to as threshold. Now, lots of different terms of threshold, but I'm specifically talking about the second lactate threshold, or that velocity we can sustain for about an hour. So lots of names of the same or very similar phenomenon. So LT2, lactate turn point, maximal lactate steady state, critical speed. But basically this point determines to a great extent what fraction of the percent of VO2 max we can sustain. So what percentage of that VO2 max can we sustain? Because actually, if we are below this intensity, so below that threshold intensity, we can reach a steady state in oxygen consumption, heart rate. Our effort is going to be pretty stable over time. We're going to fatigue much more slowly. But actually, as soon as we start working above this threshold, you are going to fatigue much more quickly. And the faster we go, or the greater the speed above that threshold we go. So the faster we operate above that threshold, the more quickly we're going to fatigue. And fatigue normally happens when we get to or just after we reach our VO2 max. Because when we're above this threshold, we're no longer stable, and oxygen consumption, heart rate, effort is just going to drift upwards over time until we reach exhaustion, until we reach, or just after we reach VO2 max. So that is why the threshold is really important, not just in determining like our half marathon speed or that our 10-mile speed or those intensities close to the hour range, but also why it's really important in the 5K and the 10K. Because if we're only a bit above our threshold, we're going to fatigue a lot slower than if we're a long way above our threshold. So if we're only half a kilometre an hour faster, then actually we haven't got stable physiology anymore. We're going to see a drift in our oxygen consumption, and we're going to see a slowly increase in our lactate levels, but it's going to be much slower than if we were 2 kilometers or 3 kilometers an hour above our threshold. So as soon as we start going to events that are longer than about 8 minutes, that second threshold becomes very important, because it's going to determine actually what percentage of our VO2 max can we sustain for the duration of the exercise bout. Now, as I just alluded to, we are going to reach VO2 as long as we're above that threshold. So in basically all track events, all events higher than or faster than that second threshold, we are going to probably achieve VO2 max as long as we're highly motivated. Because what's going to happen is our oxygen consumption is just going to keep drifting up over time, because we can't maintain a steady state in terms of our energy turnover. And so we're going to reach VO2 max at the end of the event. So if it's a 1500 meter race or a 10K race, if we're sufficiently motivated, we're probably going to reach heart rate max, VO2 max, lactate max at the end of that event. So in the Olympic distances, so the 5K, 10K marathon, what percentage of that VO2 max we can sustain is very important. So in terms of a marathon then, the VO2 max sets a very, very limit of performance in terms of aerobic metabolism, but obviously we can't sustain an intensity that's going to be above our second threshold, so our lactate turn point, LT2, what have you, because we're not in a steady state above that intensity, so it needs to be below that intensity. Otherwise, we're going to see a drift in our oxygen consumption over time until we reach exhaustion. So that's why this second threshold is really important, regardless of whether you're training for the 5K or if you're training for a marathon. And actually, in both of those cases, you probably want to maximize the speed at where that threshold occurs. Now, there is also a first threshold, which is the first rise in lactate above baseline levels. And that's normally intensity we can sustain for about 3 hours. Now, this is probably important in athletic performance, but probably more for like the ultra endurance events, because actually if we're operating on either side of that first threshold, that lactate threshold, then we see differences in energy substrate utilization, in the muscle fiber recruitment. So actually we're going to start recruiting more fast twitch fibers as we go above that first threshold. And generally we're going to fatigue faster above that first threshold than if we were below it. And the stress response we see is quite different depending on if we're above or below that first threshold. So actually, also important for performance, the first threshold, but probably more in those longer events. So actually, if we're talking about, the 100K, 24-hour racing, that's probably where it's going to have more influence and probably less in the marathon. Now, if you're a slower marathoner, if you're going to be running 4 hours, then actually, that's an ultra compared to what the faster guys are running in nearly half that speed. So if you're a slower marathoner, then maybe that first lactate threshold is important. But I would say that when we're talking about primary determinants of the Olympic disciplines in highly trained runners, it's that second threshold which is going to be the key determinant of what percentage of a VO2 max we can sustain. So that's the first two parts of a model. We've got our VO2 max, so it sets the upper ceiling of aerobic metabolism. We've got our metabolic thresholds that are going to determine what percentage of that VO2 max we can sustain. Okay, so what percentage of that oxygen consumption can we sustain? So say our VO2 max is 60, and for a 5K we can maintain 95% of that VO2 max, then that is going to be a VO2 of 54 mil per kilogram per minute that we can sustain on average over the course of the bout, because remember, we're going to start off at a lower value, but it's going to drift up over time and probably reach our VO2 max of 60 upon exhaustion. But our metabolic thresholds are determining that we can sustain 95% of that VO2, 54 mil per kilogram per minute. But what does that actually mean in terms of speed? So that's where running economy comes into play. So how running economy is effectively how good are we at converting oxygen consumption into running velocity. And it's multifactorial, but we can express it in a number of different ways. So we primarily do it by getting someone in the lab, measuring their oxygen consumption at a range of different speeds, and just seeing what the oxygen cost is. So we can look at the oxygen cost of, say, a standard a standard running speed. So actually in elite runners, we often talk about what is the oxygen cost of running at 16 kilometers an hour. But we can also look at the amount of oxygen that you need to cover a certain distance. So typically a kilometer. So actually, how much oxygen do you need to run a kilometer in? And just like VO2 max, it's much more useful to scale that to body weight. So how much oxygen do you need per kilogram of body weight to run a kilometer in? And you're going to get a number which is probably somewhere between 250 and 150. Okay, 150 to 250 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight to cover a kilometer. Now, the lower the number, the better it is, because that means you need less oxygen to travel that kilometer distance in. So that means you're more economical. At 150 is like the I think the greatest, the best, most economical measure that anyone has ever found. And I think I might be wrong now, but it was in Zerenese Tedesse, so the Eritrean, who formerly had the running economy formerly had the world record for the half marathon and was part of the original Nike Breaking 2 project, because actually, although he didn't ever run a fantastic marathon, when they did the screening process to try and select the athletes, he was identified as someone who had exceptional economy, which you would think would translate into superior marathon performance. Now, it didn't quite play out for him, but he was certainly someone who was very economical. Someone else who was also very economical was Paula Radcliffe. And I think the best measure for her was about 160, mid 160 mil per kilogram of body weight per kilometer, which again is very, very economical. But if you've got someone, average Joe off the street, they might be 240, 250 mil per kilogram per kilometer. Okay, so that's significantly worse. They're needing a lot more oxygen to run at the given pace, as well as probably having inferior VO2 maxes and metabolic thresholds. So that completes the model then. We've got our VO2 max that sets the ceiling of aerobic metabolism, our metabolic thresholds that are going to determine what percentage of that VO2 max we can sustain. So what's the oxygen consumption that we can sustain for a given event. And then we've got our running economy, which is going to determine how well we can convert that oxygen consumption, so that energy that we're producing from a metabolism of fats and carbohydrates. How well are we turning that energy into running speed? Now, hopefully, you're already I've got an appreciation and understanding, having me explain this, that we can achieve the same performance level by having by many different ways. We could have someone with a very high VO2 max, but actually someone who maybe can't sustain quite as high a percentage of that VO2 max due to having worse thresholds, and only average running economy might run the same time for 5K and 10K as an athlete who had actually quite a lot lower VO2 max, but could sustain a higher percentage of it and had better running economy. And that's going to influence the type of training that that athlete might want to do. It might influence their pacing strategies, and it probably is going to influence what event they're most suited for now and in the future. But we're going to talk about that a little bit later on in the podcast. So that's the basic structure of our understanding, our model proposed by Michael Joyner on the physiological determinants of endurance running performance. But we have got a few add-ons which I think are particularly relevant for the extremes. So if we're talking about the middle distance events like the 800 meters, the 1500 meters, 3K, and the 5K, to every event to an extent, but actually primarily those shorter events, then the anaerobic capacity of an individual becomes very important, because that is the amount of work the amount of energy we can generate over and above our VO2 max. So the energy that we can release from non-aerobic sources. So our glycolytic capacity, our energy we can get from phosphocreatine stores, which effectively gives you a battery of energy which you can either release sparingly over the course of 1,500 meters to improve your average running velocity and so reduce your time, or you can save it all up for the end of a race where you can have a big final last 400 final last lap and outkick your opponents. And obviously that's going to be very important in the shorter events, in terms of improving your 1,500 meter time, your 800 meter time, because they're events that are happening over and above our speed at VO2 max. But also in the longer events, even the half marathon, it came down to a sprint finish. It's going to, at least in part, be determined by our anaerobic capacity. Now, for a long time, that was thought to be just the whole story, but actually more recently, it's been established that your maximal sprint speed, which isn't the same thing as anaerobic capacity. So actually, anaerobic capacity is very hard to measure. We haven't got a good measure of anaerobic capacity, but let's just think of it as the speed that we can sustain for 400 meters. Now, it's a very crude way of thinking about it, but it works as a model, I think, of a model in terms of our understanding. Now, our maximal sprint speed is the maximal velocity that we can sustain, probably for about 20 or 30 meters, or even in a 100-meter race, they're slowing down at the end. Our maximal sprint speed is actually the maximal velocity that we can achieve, probably only for a few seconds. Now, they're going to be quite closely correlated. Someone who is quick over 100 meters is obviously going to be quick over 400 meters, but they're not quite the same thing. And a maximal sprint speed seems to be especially important for events like the 800 meters and the 1,500 meters, where we are going to see big surges at the start of a race to get a good position, and at the end of a race when we're trying to do a finishing kick. And actually, if we've got a big maximal sprint speed that we can rely on, that means that speeds that are slightly slower are going to not cost us quite as much effectively. So in the middle distance events, as well as anaerobic capacity, our maximal sprint speed is very important. But I'd say they're a sub-determinant of performance. Anaerobic capacity is key. Maximal sprint speed probably important, but maybe not quite as important as our anaerobic capacity. But certainly together, they can help explain the performance in the middle distances. Now, if we go to the other extreme, if we go to events such as the marathon or ultra events, there's a newer concept which has been labelled durability. And basically, this, although when we are below that second threshold, or that intensity that we can sustain for about an hour, although we see a steady state in terms of oxygen consumption, heart rate, lactate, lots of other metabolic markers, when we are below that threshold and we hold that pace for a long time, it's only a sort of quasi-steady state. And but actually you will see these markers still deteriorate. These fatigue markers will still deteriorate over the course of the exercise bout. And if we if we could take someone out at 20 miles of the marathon, got them on the treadmill and measured their VO2 max, their metabolic thresholds, their running economy, they would not be as good as when we tested them in the fresh state before, a week before they did the marathon. And so this has led to this concept of durability, where actually some athletes seem to be better maintain these physiological parameters than others. So people have suggested, although we haven't got the evidence to back that up, that one of the reasons Eliud Kipchoge is the world record holder and he's so good is that he can maintain his thresholds, his VO2 max, his running economy very well relative to other competitors. Now, he certainly looks that way. He still looks sublime in his running form at the end of a sub 2 hour marathon, but that doesn't really tell us that much about the internal physiology. But what we can say is that I very much expect he is more durable than myself as a 2:15 marathon runner. And certainly compared to someone who's running 3 hours, 3.5 hours, 4 hours, I expect that he can maintain his exceptional physiology much better than others. So I'd say those three, the anaerobic capacity, maximal sprint speed, and durability, are sort of bolt-ons to the model, which become more or less important depending upon the duration of the event. But I still think the key parameters, certainly in the endurance events, are VO2 max, metabolic thresholds, and running economy. So that's our model. What I want to do now is break down some of these physiological parameters, because I think most people understand these things on a superficial level, but actually, what actually is VO2 max? What determines VO2 max? When we want to improve it, what adaptations are we looking to achieve to try and achieve that? So let's start with VO2 max. And actually, the primary limiter of VO2 max is how good we are at distributing oxygen to the muscles. So our muscles are very, very good at using oxygen, and actually they can use oxygen over and above they've got the ability to use oxygen over and above our ability to supply it. So there's so many mitochondria that we can always use more oxygen. Our issue is getting the oxygen to the muscles. And so VO2 max is primarily limited by our cardiovascular system. So one misconception with endurance sport and exercise is that our lungs are limiting our ability to breathe in oxygen. This isn't true. Our lungs are immensely well designed in that they have a capacity to transfer oxygen from the air into our blood and CO2 out of our blood into the air at an exceptional rate, again over and above what we will ever need to or be able to use. And our lungs, because of this, our lungs don't really adapt to training, right? They're already exceptionally well developed, and so we can forget about the lungs when we're talking about VO2 max. But what is definitely important is our cardiac output, so our maximal cardiac output. So how much blood can we pump around our circulatory system? Now, obviously, we're talking about the heart here. So our max heart rate is going to determine our maximum cardiac output, the max amount of blood we can pump out of that left ventricle, which is going to feed our systemic circulation. But we can't do much about our max heart rate, so we can forget about that for VO2 max as well. We can't really do anything to change our max heart rate. Unfortunately, it goes down a little bit with age. And maybe there's some evidence to suggest that if we keep exercising, we can hopefully maintain that max heart rate a bit better. But that's I would say that's not clear cut. But what we can do is improve our stroke volume. So actually, that is how much blood we can pump out of our heart in a single beat. And that's one of the key adaptations we get with endurance training, is that our left ventricle, as I said, feeds the systemic circulation with the blood that is going to be pumped not to our lungs, but to our muscles and our skin and in our brain and all the organs of our body, except the lungs. So we get expansion of this left ventricle. So actually, the ventricle can hold more blood, and so we can pump more blood out in a single beat. We're going to get a thickening of the walls of the ventricle, so actually they can contract more forcefully, again increasing the amount of blood that is pumped out of the ventricle. And the actual way in which the heart contracts becomes more efficient. So our heart doesn't, it contracts, but it contracts with a twist, and effectively the heart gets better at twisting the blood out of the ventricle and pumping it into the aorta to the rest of the body, meaning that actually there's less blood left in that ventricle after it's completely contracted. So we've got multiple different ways, and effectively our heart can increase its capacity to pump blood around the body, which means that we can increase the amount of oxygen that we get to the working muscles. Now, another adaptation that we can have is within the blood itself. So we can, one, increase the amount of blood we have. So that even without thinking about hemoglobin actually having more blood, a bigger blood volume, seems to be a beneficial adaptation that we get with endurance training, and also with things such as heat exposure as well. So that's something to think about, and maybe we can talk about in another podcast. But yeah, the amount of blood we have is important. But probably the main thing that we think about is the amount of hemoglobin we have. So the total amount of hemoglobin, the hemoglobin mass, which is the oxygen carrying protein within our red blood cells. The more of that we have, then the more oxygen we can carry in a given unit of blood. So if we can pump the blood at a faster rate around the body, and that blood can hold more oxygen, then that's going to increase our VO2 max. Now, there's one last determinant of VO2 max, and actually that's how good our body is at extracting the oxygen from the blood into the muscles. And this doesn't actually change as much with training compared to our stroke volume, for example, our cardiac adaptations. But actually, this is something that does seem to separate the more highly trained athletes from those who are not so well trained. So it's certainly an adaptation, but it's an adaptation that probably comes with doing high volumes of training compared to someone who's just moderately trained. So training adaptation that seems to happen later into an endurance training career. So there are our main determinants of VO2 max, our maximum cardiac output, so our stroke volume, the oxygen carrying capacity of our blood, and then what we call as our AVO2 difference. So it's the difference in oxygen between the concentration in our arteries and our veins, which basically represents how much oxygen we have managed to extract from the arteries compared to how much is left in the veins. So if we can make sure that we get almost all of the oxygen out of the blood, then that's going to be out of the arteries that is feeding the muscle. Then that is going to be obviously beneficial for VO2 max. Okay, so let's talk about actually breaking down our thresholds. So we'll talk about primarily that second lactate threshold, or that critical speed, that's intensity you can sustain for about an hour. So what are the determinants here? And I'd say that compared to VO2 max, we still haven't got this completely 100% defined, but there are a few things that we do know are going on which do seem to be important. So the number of mitochondria and the quality of these mitochondria, so their aerobic enzyme content, this seems to be important for determining the thresholds. Probably because if we have increased mitochondria, then we can increase the rate of aerobic respiration, our ability to oxidize fats and carbohydrates. And that's going to mean that we can, as well as lactate, And that's going to mean that we can help maintain a steady state in terms of energy turnover without having to rely upon glycolysis and go into that anaerobic capacity, feed into that anaerobic capacity battery. So the capillarization at the muscle level also it seems to be important. So actually, by that I mean how close is each individual muscle fiber to a given capillary. So the capillaries are the small, very small blood vessels which allow diffusion of oxygen and other nutrients into and out of the blood to get to our muscle fibers. So actually, if one of the adaptations we see with training is that we see an increased capillarization of our muscle fibers, so that each muscle fiber is surrounded by more capillaries. And now this is also a characteristic of slow twitch muscle fibers, and we see quite a significant correlation between the amount of slow twitch muscle fibers an athlete has and the how good their threshold is. So this seems to be important because, again, it's going to allow oxygen to more efficiently get into the mitochondria to be used to generate energy in a sustainable fashion. And then the other thing that seems to be important is what we call lactate transporters. So lactate is actively moved in and out of cells. And actually, lactate is a really good energy source. So if we can increase the amount of lactate that can be burnt as an energy source by our mitochondria, then that may help with maintaining a steady state as well. And so there have been associations with having more of these lactate transporters that can move lactate from fast twitch fibers into slow twitch fibers, for example, and our thresholds. So not as well defined in terms of what makes up our thresholds. What are the adaptations we're seeing when we've got higher thresholds, but that are manifesting in higher thresholds. But some of the mitochondria, the capillarization, and the lactate transporters are three things that are very likely to be involved, I would say. And now the last physiological parameter, running economy. Now this is one which I think a lot of people do get confused about, and that's because it's multifactorial. So there's no one key determinant of running economy. There's lots of different things that go on to make someone more or less economical. And these can basically be broken down into two main components. We've got a mechanical component, and which I would talk about things such as having elastic tendons, our running mechanics. So are we good at applying force in the right direction to translate that into forward propulsion? If we've got, like I said, a good springy elastic tendon Achilles tendon that can recycle energy efficiently. So that mechanical component. But then we've also got a physiological component. So actually what is happening within the muscle fibers themselves would determine how good are we at converting oxygen into ATP, which can be used for muscle contraction. Now, for example, slow twitch fibers are more economical than fast twitch fibers. So slow twitch fibers are better at converting oxygen into contraction, which is interesting because actually one of the adaptations that we seem to see continue to develop an athlete's performance long into their career is their running economy. And there's a classic study that's examined Paula Radcliffe's economy over the course of her 10-year long career, and it showed the VO2 max was effectively stable, but her economy improved significantly from the age of, I think it was, you first tested about 16, And then I think her last testing within this study was just before it was after she broke the marathon world record. So it was probably about 10 years later. And I think at the start of when she was 16, her economy was about 203 mil per kilogram per kilometer. But when she was breaking the world record for a marathon, it was about 100, I think it was about 165 mil per kilogram per kilometer. But her VO2 max was pretty stable at 70. So one of the things that might be happening here is that the long-term training, the long-term accumulation of miles is making some of those fast twitch fibers more like slow twitch fibers. And as part of this, they're becoming more economical. So I think the key takeaway is that economy is multifactorial, and that actually just because someone looks like they're not very economical, it doesn't mean that they're not very economical. For a classic example, again, going back to Paula Radcliffe, didn't look like the most efficient person running along with her bobbing head, but actually had exceptional running economy. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about actually out of these physiological parameters, what are probably the more important ones for each individual event. And I think I've alluded to this a bit already. But for example, let's take the middle distance events, and by that I'm saying 800 meters to the 5K, or maybe 800 meters to the 3K. I think in this range, I would rank probably VO2 max is actually one of the most important factors, because we're operating 100% of our VO2 max. We're using our entire aerobic capacity during the event. So actually, if we can have a higher VO2 max, a higher ceiling for aerobic metabolism, then this is going to be really important. As I've already mentioned, the anaerobic capacity is going to be key, especially in 800 meter events, especially for the men, where actually it is becoming a more of a long sprint. The duration is just shorter, and so the absolute speeds now are very, very quick. So anaerobic capacity and maximal sprint speed become very important. And obviously running economy is always going to be important, because actually that is going to determine how good we are at converting oxygen into speed. So regardless of whether we're running the 800 meters or whether we're running the marathon, it's always better to be economical. Now, what I would say for the middle distances is probably, certainly for the 8 and 15, that is less important, not unimportant, are those thresholds. I'd say that where they do become more important is when you've got multiple rounds of an event, which you need to get through in order to get to the final. Because I think the literature on this isn't, as far as I'm aware, that there's not much research on it. But I think anecdotally, and from what I've seen with athletes I work with, if you've got a higher threshold, then the actual recovery time and the cost of a single 1500 meter race is going to be less, and so that it's going to mean that you're going to be less fatigued going into your semi-final and your final. So I think that is one of the key differences between someone who can run a one-off single 1500 meter race really well, really fast, but maybe can't translate that as well into having already done a heats, a semis, and then have to race a final. Now, as the events get longer, the thresholds become more and more important, because we're no longer operating right at our VO2 max. So we can compensate by having a lower VO2 max by working at a higher percentage of it. So we want to be able to work as a higher percentage of that VO2 max as we can. So I'd say 10K plus, 10K to marathon. So we want as higher threshold as we can. We want to be able to run as far at a very high level whilst being able to maintain a steady state in oxygen consumption, in our lactate, etc. And so that the thresholds become incredibly important. Whereas things that become less important especially if we're just worried about running as fast as we can and we don't need to rely on a big sprint finish, are the anaerobic capacity and our maximal sprint speed. So for that's basically the vast majority of us aren't that bothered about how fast we can run at the last 200 meters, 400 meters in, because that's not going to save us much time. If you can run 60 seconds at the end of your last 400, then maybe you've saved 10 seconds, compared to your mean average pace of 72 seconds. If we're running 30-minute 10K pace, we've saved 10 seconds there. But if we can improve our threshold by half a kilometer an hour, then that's going to translate into about 5 seconds faster every kilometer, which is very significant and much more than those 10 seconds we can gain by just really hammering that anaerobic capacity work. So the thresholds become more important the longer we go. VO2 max is always going to be important because it sets the ceiling. But I would say now we move into a point where VO2 max needs to be good enough, but it doesn't need to be exceptionally high. And interestingly, there was a paper released as part of the Breaking 2 recruitment strategy, which involved physiological testing of, I think it was about 15 to 20 Nike-sponsored athletes, most of them East African, when they were trying to find people for the Breaking 2 project. And they reported the mean data for each of the participants. So unfortunately, we don't have the individual data. We can't say Eliud Kipchoge's VO2 max was X and his economy was Y. But the mean out of we've got the means from those data, and actually the VO2 max was quite not low, but probably lower than you'd expect. It was up in the low 70s, which is high. But I know I've tested half a dozen people with VO2 max above 70. Like my VO2 max, I've had it measured at but between 75 and 80 3 or 4 times, and so I'm confident that it's in that ballpark range, depending on my fitness levels. But what this demonstrates is that actually in the longer events, your economy and the fraction that you can sustain is much more important, the much bigger predictor of performance than actually what your VO2 max is. Now, in the marathon, economy does become quite important. And it's certainly a useful thing to be economical, because that means that you need less energy to run at a given pace. And that means you're going to break down your glycogen stores at a reduced rate compared to someone who's less economical. So I think as we go to an event which is fuel limited, like the marathon, economy does become very important, because we simply can't take on carbohydrate at a great enough rate to replace all of that which we're using by breaking down glycogen. So I'd say for the 10K to a half marathon, thresholds are exceptionally important, as well as economy and VO2 max, but I'd say the thresholds and thresholds probably most important. And then as we go to the marathon, it probably goes to economy becomes more of a factor. Now, in terms of the ultra events, so events over and above the marathon, so let's talk about the 50K, the 100K, 24 hours, then it becomes actually much less predictable. And maybe this is where this concept of durability, which I mentioned earlier, maybe that is the key parameter for success in those events, as well as psychological things as well. Because the thing with the ultra events is, certainly when we're talking about events that are lasting 6 hours plus, actually, because the rate of energy turnover is quite low, our economy doesn't need to be exceptional, because we can effectively eat all the carbohydrate we need and can nearly match our demands reasonably effectively when we're working at these lower intensities, because our energy turnover isn't as high. We can, and it's much easier to consume energy when we're running more maximally. Economy might not be that important in the ultra events. And likewise, the threshold needs to be good enough. We need to be below. We need to be below that first lactate threshold. So that is important. But again, when we're going to 24-hour events, we're well below that first lactate threshold. So I expect that the concept of durability becomes very important. I think as well as just actually making good decisions, being practical, being able to look after yourself, taking on fuel effectively, and as well having the psychological robustness to cope with exercising for such a long time becomes more of a parameter than our traditional VO2 max thresholds in economy, for example. So I've talked about our physiological model in terms of different events and what are the things that may or may not be as important or are important. But I think what I'd like to do now is talk about more the interaction between VO2 max thresholds and economy in terms of what I see in the lab and when I'm making my training recommendations based upon physiological data that I've collected. What's my thought process there in terms of actually making those recommendations? And I think we'll go through in the order that I presented earlier, so VO2 max, thresholds, and economy. So first, let's take the VO2 max number. The first thing you want to know is actually what event is the athlete training for? Because if they're training for one of those middle distance events, as I said, the bigger the better, probably. So actually, we're always wanting to see an improvement in VO2 max. And there's probably no reason for me to say, actually, no, your VO2 max is good enough. You can probably not think about that anymore. You can probably try and prioritize your training around other attributes. I don't think there's a case where that would actually happen. So for most people, what you want to just see, and if you're concentrating on middle distances, is when VO2 max is just it's continuously going up over time. Now, people have said that VO2 max isn't that trainable. It is trainable. I'd say it's less trainable, or it certainly is less trainable than the thresholds, that metabolic side of things. But it is trainable, even in people who have been a long history of training. You can still see changes. Now, they might be small, but you can see them as long as you're progressing the training that an athlete is doing. Now, as the event gets longer, we then need to see, actually, is VO2 max the key limiter for you? Or maybe there's other things that are limiting your performance. So that's when we move on to the thresholds. And here, we effectively want, when talking about 5K, 10K plus, we effectively want our thresholds to be as high as we possibly can. But the caveat is we can only move our threshold to a certain percentage of our VO2 max. Our threshold obviously can't be 100% of our VO2 max. That's not physically or physiologically possible. And what we tend to see from elite data is that the limit to how high our threshold can be is probably in the low 90%. So about 90 to 92%. If your threshold is sitting at 90 to 92% of your VO2 max, you probably can't improve it much further. In which case, even if you're a longer endurance athlete, maybe improving your VO2 max should be your number one priority, because actually you've already maximized how much you can improve your threshold. Now, I think with the athletes having looked at the athletes, with the athletes I've worked with, the athletes who present with these test results, those ones who actually maybe need to go and do a bit more VO2 max work and improving those adaptations, tend to actually be more triathletes who have got a very high training volume, or potentially marathoners who have really deprioritized high intensity work and have just done loads of marathon specific work with not much even at threshold. I think they're the sort of training histories that present with these test results who actually maybe need a bit more intensity. But I would say that the vast majority of people, and if has still got plenty of room to improve their threshold. I think it's only if you're dealing with extremes, so extremes of volume or extreme just use of marathon pace intensity, that I see people have maximized their threshold and don't have room to improve their VO2 max further. It does happen, but I'd say it's rare. But I do think that's one of the key things that you can only really find out from being tested in the lab. It's very hard to establish, I'd say, those the idea of is your threshold being capped out by your VO2 max or not. I think that's hard to identify unless you actually get tested in the lab. But it's certainly something that has happened, and I have had athletes present with that, and actually they do seem to respond well to doing a bit more high intensity work. So work above their threshold, between their threshold and VO2 max intensity. And this does seem to, and then going back to doing some more threshold work, they do seem to be able to improve that threshold further. So there's that's the threshold. And then running economy. As I said, everyone can improve running economy. That's going to help. So that's going to help all events. If we can become more economical, we're going to run faster for a given energy cost, for a given effort. We're going to run faster. Right, that's an adaptation that everyone should be trying to pursue. But I think it is something that's actually quite hard to change, and it's also extremely hard to identify if it's something that's more of a mechanical limiter or if it's something more physiological. Now you can do some testing protocols to try and tease this apart a bit. We can look at things such as your tendon properties by doing jump testing, looking at how good are you at recycling energy, at producing force. And if you're great at that, then maybe it's more of a physiological thing, which is probably a training volume issue. You might just need to do more training and do more training over more years, and that's going to lead to doing more economical. But if an athlete comes in and their economy is very bad, and they're not doing any strength training, any plyometric training, which is both being associated with improvements in running economy, that would be probably one of my recommendations. Because that is something that athletes might respond to a bit more quickly than just do more training for more years. And if it's something they're not doing already, it's probably a gap in their training structure, which filling will hopefully lead to beneficial adaptations. Now, you can't improve economy indefinitely, obviously, because you can't use no oxygen to run at a given pace. And so if an athlete, I've had athletes come who are those middle distance athletes, and they've got exceptional economy. Maybe not the best ever, but very good. So 100, I'd say like 190 mil per kilogram per kilometer is very good. You don't see that every day at all. If someone's presenting with that, but their VO2 max is low, I would say your economy, can always be better, but it's pretty good. I wouldn't prioritize that. Keep doing your strength training if you're doing it already, and keep trying to accumulate miles, because that's you're going to be doing that as part of targeting other physiological parameters. But it shouldn't be a priority for you. VO2 max is probably the thing you need to chase. So maybe if you already have exceptional economy, then you're going to get more bang for your buck by chasing VO2 max and thresholds. But I think as a most part, economy should be something that's on the mind of every athlete, and should be a goal to keep improving that over time. So I'd say that is really the key way in which lab testing can help inform an athlete's training, is that it can help make them be more specific and target the things that are primarily limiting them. Now, if a good club level runner who's been running 5 or 6 hours a week for 5 years comes to the lab, they can probably improve everything. Right? Economy isn't going to be exceptional. It's not going to be we're not going to have world-class economy. They're not going to have world-class thresholds in terms of percentage of VO2 max, and they're not going to have a world-class VO2 max. But what you can see is actually maybe you can identify the low-hanging fruit. So actually, if something's really letting them down relative to the others, then that can help with a training prescription. And it also can help you be more specific in how you actually target those adaptations. So actually, if we need to improve our threshold, what actually is your threshold? What intensities are going to be more favorable in terms of seeing those adaptations of the threshold compared to our VO2 max? And actually, what intensities should you probably target in order to see changes in your VO2 max? So although everybody can probably improve everything, even Kipchoge can probably get a 0.1% better in terms of his economy thresholds and VO2 max. I think lab testing can help you identify what is the primary thing that's letting you down and help you be more specific in the training that is going to lead to adaptations that are going to help improve one of those parameters. Now, I realize I've been talking for an hour and 6 minutes, so I think I'm going to wrap it up there. I did plan to talk a little bit more about actually what types of training can lead to are probably best for improving VO2 max, economy thresholds, anaerobic capacity, maximal sprint speed, etc. But I think that could easily be another half an hour and maybe is best served for a separate podcast. So I'm sorry if you were hanging on for me to start talking about that, but it does become complicated and I want to do a good job of covering it. And I also said I was going to talk about tactics and pacing and how your physiological profile can influence those, your tactics and pacing. Again, I think that might be a bit of an overkill for this episode. So I am going to wrap it up there. I think key takeaways are that the main determinants of endurance running performance are the VO2 max, the percentage you can sustain, which is dictated by your thresholds, and then your running economy, which determines how effective you are at turning that oxygen consumption into running velocity. You then got additional factors depending on the extremes of the distances that you're covering. So if you're doing the middle distances, your anaerobic capacity and your maximal sprint speed become much more important. Whereas if you're going to the marathon and to ultra events, then actually durability is something that becomes more important in those events. I think I hope you now understand a bit more about how they relate to each other in terms of actually there are many different ways of achieving the same performance. We can compensate by having a low VO2 max with a high running economy. So if we're more efficient, we can compensate for having a lower VO2 max. Certainly in the longer events where we can compensate by having a low VO2 max by a high threshold. But actually, most people can get better at everything. And lab tests can help us. I'm not trying to sell lab tests here, but I am a physiologist and I'm a bit biased. But actually, lab tests, and importantly, lab tests with results that have been appropriately put into context and understood and translated effectively, they can help us to optimize training and help in training prescription and ultimately help promote adaptations that are going to be most favorable for improved performance at the individual level. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there for today. I do promise that it won't be so long until I release another podcast. If you did find this content interesting and you'd like to hear more of it, I have started a buy me a coffee page where you can treat me to a caffeine hit, which will stimulate me to produce more podcasts more regularly, and make it something a bit more viable for me to do going forward. So yeah, I understand times are hard, so obviously no obligation at all. You can download this and listen to this as many times as you like, and future podcasts. But if you have got any free cash, no one's got free cash. If anyone's got any spare cash going around, or feels that my content is interesting and worth it, then yeah, please do feel free to treat me to a coffee. The link will be in the show notes. So I will end there. Thank you very much for listening, and speak to you all soon.